I recently wrote an article deconstructing dungeon design in The Legend of Zelda A Link to the Past. The goal was to try and define a core set of principles which make dungeons memorable, enjoyable, and overall exciting experiences. What design choices separate the best dungeons from the worst? If you haven't checked it out yet, I encourage you to do so, but in this video, I want to focus on the results of that work. Deconstructing Zelda Dungeons was only half of the battle. I wanted to challenge myself to take what I had learned and make a dungeon of my own. The goal was relatively simple, to make a great Zelda dungeon that felt at home in the A Link to the Past universe. Designing, iterating, testing, and programming this dungeon prototype was an arduous process that lasted 3 months, but before I discuss too much about how my expansion was made, I wanted to give you the opportunity to experience it without any spoilers. There are links to download the game on my website, but note that you will need a Windows PC and a compatible Xbox One controller to play the game. For those of you who can't play, there is also a full uninterrupted playthrough of the dungeon so you could watch. I highly encourage you play or watch the dungeon before going any further in the video, as I will be explaining the nuts and bolts of the design, assuming you have a general idea of how the final dungeon was implemented. Let's get back to the goals of this project. One of my goals was to design a dungeon that felt justified, a new experience for A Link to the Past. I thought about my history with the game and realized how peculiar it was that each dungeon ended in the same way. You do a bunch of puzzle solving, find some keys, slash at some Stalfos, and then always finish at a grandiose final battle that is almost entirely combat focused. It's a common trope for video games, and there's nothing inherently wrong about it. Scary and dangerous boss battles are a great way to build tension, but I wanted to explore other ways to build tension as well, which is where the theme for my dungeon originated. I wanted to design a Zelda dungeon which amounted to a climactic finish without resulting to an ultimate combat encounter. With that vision at hand, I started developing various concepts which might succeed at eliciting the player experience I was trying to achieve. I cooked up designs where there would be an unkillable boss, forcing the player to rely on clever means to overcome their foe. But in the end, I went with a self-destruct style dungeon where the dungeon would begin to fall apart after a certain point. I felt that this idea struck the right balance between not being overly complex on the player and having fail states that were consistent with the rest of the A Link to the Past experience. This lava volcano theme became a natural extension from the self-destruct idea. Volcanoes erupt, and lava can be used as both a puzzle mechanic and a way to elicit danger. In particular, A Link to the Past players are already familiar with water flow thanks to the Watergate dungeon in the game, so making a dangerous version of water gave me confidence that the learning curve wouldn't be too steep when compared to the other ideas that I had. With that in mind, I took the lava flow concept and began highlighting ideas that I felt could create tension without relying on pure combat. There was the Red Sea, which presented the player with a platform-sparse environment, forcing them to navigate through the torrid lava below while evading dangerous debris and enemies. Hopscotch weaved pools of lava with falling debris to push players towards traversing through lava and land. Khazad-dûm was appropriately named after the bridge in The Lord of the Rings, where I envisioned players running for their lives across a falling bridge. The raft is an item first originating from the original Legend of Zelda that I modernized to be useful in A Link to the Past. It works in a similar way to its predecessor, as it allows the player to skate across bodies of liquid, but my raft would allow the player to use items while traversing, meaning that they could fight enemies and change directions with the hookshot while being surrounded by lava. Because of its Zelda roots, and the fact that it's a tool that doesn't have to be specifically activated by a button press, I thought it would be a perfect mid-dungeon item for the player to easily learn. With the core experiences figured out, I cobbled together my first fully connected dungeon design and was initially really pleased with the results. Everything I wanted was in there, and I was somehow able to combine it all into a single solution. Using sprites from the game, I mapped together a layout of the dungeon to better convey how the flow might work from room to room, and it wasn't until I had this layout that the cracks in my design started to show. Having all of my ideas brought together in a mega dungeon of sorts proved to be overly complicated and hard to follow. It's true that you can come up with multiple different ways to use lava flow for puzzle mechanics, but then you have to ensure that the player completely understands the rules of lava and how it interacts in every scenario put in the game. I had puzzles where lava fell through floors, flowed in conflicting directions, and could be altered by various different in-game elements like switch walls and steel blocks. I knew that in my final design I would have to scale down these lava puzzles and make them more understandable for the player. So although I was initially happy with my first couple iterations, the dungeon needed a lot of paring down to get it to a player-friendly state. Although I had to set aside some really cool ideas, I prioritized making a stellar dungeon with a non-boss battle finale. With that in mind, let's dive into the dungeon playthrough so that you can see how the now playable design came to be. We start somewhere in the volcanic lands of Hyrule in the middle of the game. By this point, the player should know a few things about how dungeons work and be familiar with some of Link's most heavily used items, including the bow, hookshot, and bombs. Right off the bat, we have an unusual discovery. The big key is just lying there for the player to grab without any issues. I made the decision to put the key here based on the confusion I was getting surrounding the lava chest puzzle that is at the heart of this dungeon design. It wasn't being well understood that in order to unfreeze the big chest, the player needed to bring lava down upon it in some way. So if I could get the player thinking more about how they could unfreeze the chest, and less about where the key is to open the chest, then I thought they may have a greater chance of connecting those dots. The next room is meant to be as memorable as possible for the player. The big chest being there signifies that there's good loot to be found in this area and that you should probably return at some point. It's on a pedestal of sorts and is covered in ice to make it stand out even further. The player can then easily walk up to the chest and interact with it. This was important as I needed to convince the player that there was no reasonable way that they could break through this ice without some sort of means that they did not have access to at that moment. Previous iterations of this room didn't allow the player to interact with the chest, which led some to believe that maybe they could just chip away at the ice with their sword or something like that. The introduction to lava. As stated in my Deconstruction of Dungeon Design article, the best Zelda dungeons allow the player to learn new mechanics and items in a safe and experimental way. There's nothing else for the player to worry about here but the lava. Touching it will cause them to lose a life and help them to form the connection that lava equals bad. The hookshot is vital to many of the later puzzles in the dungeon, so a hard stop like this ensures that the player can't go any further until they remember and feel comfortable using the hookshot. It's also the first time I asked the player to use a specific tool, which gives them the chance to learn how to switch tools in a safe environment. After multiple rooms of relative safety, I felt that it was time to begin revving up the tension up to the midpoint climax, which Zelda games often do with enemy encounters. In this case, I forced the player to deal with these new enemy designs before moving any further. They can hop back and forth within the lava and must be attacked via a ranged weapon. There are arrows in the skull in the upper right hand corner of the room to further hint towards how they might defeat these foes. There are more enemies and traps in this room, and at this point it might be worth bringing up how it was decided which obstacles I should be using in the design. I noted from my previous research that A Link to the Past dungeons typically introduce traps or enemies in starter dungeons and then ramp up their challenge later in different ones. So I went through and mapped out how familiar a player might be with every obstacle type in the game around the midpoint of the experience to see which ones would be expected to make a return around this point. The rolling traps were the perfect example of this, as they had just only been briefly introduced beforehand. The right side of this room also went through a couple iterations due to feedback. Initially, there was only one bombable wall and absolute nothingness in the right hand side here. I intended the area to look ominously bleak, but instead, the impression players received was unfinished. So when it came time to return to this area in the finale, well, they didn't return to that area. I added a couple of fake bombable walls, skulls to throw, and a lower floor with loot that begs the player to question how they might get over this ledge at some point in the future. Here is a completely optional room that rewards the player for bombing the wall. I wanted to reinforce that wall bombing concept without necessarily deviating from the happy path. So far, there haven't been any clues as to how the player is supposed to unfreeze the chest below. I wanted to help them make that connection between object permanence between floors, as in some things can fall below. So I brought back the beetles from the Tower of Hera, which showcases this idea perfectly, and set this enemy up so that it would effortlessly fall on the first touch by the player. This next room represents the midpoint of the dungeon, really. Because of this, it actually mimics the climax in a multitude of ways. At the end of the dungeon, I want players to feel the dangers of hookshotting amongst enemies and debris while rafting over lava. Here, the player has more time to think and doesn't have to worry about the rafting, but they are still avoiding obstacles while hookshotting across the area. It's a smaller climax within the bigger picture. It's also designed to remind players that hookshots can be used on things that are not steel blocks. Here you have a steel block blocks suspiciously placed across the gap from a chest with no other observable way to get across. On the way out, the player is forced to use the hookshot on 2 skulls to return to the exit. These 2 different elements will ideally have the effect of keeping the versatility of the hookshot in mind when they get back to the big chest below. The linchpin of my lava flow puzzle. In previous designs, the lava flowed from the 4th floor, and the player had to guide it through each subsequent floor until it reached the chest. This proved way too overly complex for a single dungeon to handle. So instead, I streamlined the puzzle so that once the lava flow turns on, it would seemingly go directly atop the chest with ice, prompting the player to return to the room to see what's changed. They already have the big key after all. I really like how this room has changed at this midpoint in a way that isn't that common for Zelda Dungeons to do. First, it actually sets up perfect foreshadowing for what's about to happen when the volcano erupts. Secondly, the way it's designed allows the player to easily get to the chest platform without the raft, but they can't leave the platform without the raft. They are essentially stuck. And although I thought about adding text which specifically explains how the raft works so that they know that they can leave at any point just by rafting across the lava, I wanted to push the player to explore themselves, because figuring out how certain mechanics work on their own makes it better sink into the player's mind when they have to recall that later on, like when they have to cross a smaller path of lava and need to remember how they did that originally. They are completely surrounded, but the smallest step towards the lava will immediately show them the power of the raft. Before the eruption can fully begin, there's one last trick I needed to ensure that the player understood: the ability to hook shot and use items while on the raft. In order to get the key to progress onward, the player has to raft across the lava pit and hook onto the steel blocks. So far, they've done both of these things separately. The player can raft all they want, but they will never make it to the isolated platform with the chest. The steel block should be a dead giveaway here and make the player think to themselves, if only I could hook onto there. This is the Calm Before the Storm room. It has multiple skulls to hard up before the climax. It also acts as the perfect before and after stage for the player so that they understand that the dungeon has changed significantly since the volcano erupted. These falling lava rocks were instrumental to keeping the tension high at a time like this. I was trying to recreate the same heart-pounding feeling of fighting a boss, but through non-combat means. It was vitally important to ensure that the player didn't feel like it was safe to just waft around or stand still and let the time pass. By hurtling damaged boulders their way, the idea was to encourage them to be non-stop moving. Here, this room has been completely shattered. Doorways are stuck behind rocks, the traps have been obscured, and a path seems to be clearing to head to the right. I'm also hoping that players remember the rupees that were hidden in that section below. They won't find rupees, but they will find lava. And at this point, it should hopefully be clear what players can do with lava. Finally, we made it to my Red Sea finale. I tried to throw the kitchen sink into this last stretch here. We start off with a safe opportunity to once again solidify the player's familiarity with hookshotting while on the raft. They've only had to do this once at this point, so I really want to make sure they feel comfortable. No debris or enemies can harm them yet. Now that they've crossed this figurative threshold, all dangers are fair game. There will be enemies, debris, and other obstacles standing in their way of the exit. Almost immediately is a jumped up version of the puzzle that they just solved with the lava and the hookshot, but now failing to hit the hookshot will mean that they'll run straight into an enemy. The beetle was meant to annoy the player in a time where they just want to leave. Beetles are designed to run headfirst at the player and push them, while this platform is right in the middle of a debris spawner. It's an uncomfortable place, and I wanted the player to feel uncomfortable dealing with this enemy when all they wanted to do was move past. Finally, this last stretch involves more lava than actual platforms. The player has to hop, raft, and hook between areas to move downward and avoid enemies and debris. Making it through gives the player some rupees, as I somewhat cruelly teased rupees earlier without any way of delivering on that promise, so I wanted to make sure I did deliver on that promise. And there you have it. The player made it outside and they've gotten their prize. I hope this video gave you some more insight into the thought process behind my design for a new dungeon in The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. If you have any further questions or would like to discuss this more, please feel free to send me an email or contact me through other means like Twitter. Thank you.